Hello Internet, I'm Zon, and welcome to another episode of Drawing Commentary. Now it's been a long time since I've recorded one of these, and I figured since the year's coming to a close soon as of the time of this recording, I thought I would do something a little bit different. If you're new around here to the channel, normally what I do for these drawing commentaries is I will record myself doing a design in Rhinoceros, kind of like the speed drawing videos, but what I'll do is record it in real time and actually narrate as I'm drawing the design to sort of explain the drawing process and kind of talk through the whole piece from beginning to end and kind of explain how I come up with some of these designs. One thing, after checking some of the other YouTubers that I follow, I actually got this idea from one of my favorite artists I've mentioned before, but he's a gentleman named Plague of Gripes. He's a very interesting fellow, interesting artwork, and overall, there's a lot of amusing opinions on a lot of things. Well, I noticed that for a couple years, he's done a sort of retrospective on his drawings. I think most recently he did it for October. So all the drawings he did for the month of October, he compiled them, and kind of went through them in the video and talked through them and sort of self-critiqued and narrated his way through the whole process, going through all the different images. Looking back, I realized in my archives that I've been working on these two-dimensional designs in Rhinoceros for well over a decade now. It's hard to believe it's been that long. The time's really kind of flown by. But thinking way back to the beginning, I've never really done any sort of retrospective of my own work. You know, looking back at the initial designs way when I was just learning how to do all this stuff with the software, and coming forward, seeing how everything is sort of developed and evolved over time. So what I thought would be interesting would be to take a sample from my archives of all the stuff I've accumulated over the years and posted on places like my DeviantArt, and arrange them chronologically. I had to sort of guess based on the files, the design files, when they were created, so it's a rough ballpark, but it's mostly narrowed down to the year, which is the most important thing. Arrange them from oldest to newest, and for the sake of commentary in the video here, I thought I would go through the designs from, again, oldest to newest, sort of explain where they came from, critique my own work, and sort of make my observations about where the whole design process has gone. Because as I was compiling all of the images for this collection, I noticed that things have changed kind of a lot, and over time I sort of introduced new ideas and some things took the center stage, and it was kind of just interesting glancing back. And so taking a deeper look and talking through all this stuff with you guys might be interesting from a sort of reflection perspective. One, because a lot of time has passed. I had to sift through dozens of designs from way back all the way up till now, and I took the ones that I felt were the most either interesting or ones that I felt like I could talk about. And I think we'll treat this as a sort of experiment, and if it turns out to be a success, I wouldn't mind doing something like this every year. At the end of the year, compiling what I've posted for that 12-month period, and then going through it from oldest to newest again, and just seeing over the course of a year how things have changed. So what I'm going to do here is I've got my recording window set up on my computer. This is the title card that I'm going to be using for the series, and then I'm just going to click through these chronologically and explain a little bit about each piece. One thing that I noticed as I was going through these, in addition to seeing sort of the initial stages of what I was working on up till now, another thing that I'll get to talk about is the sort of random and strange naming conventions for some of my designs. The ones that are based off of established franchises like Monster Hunter or Brave Frontier are pretty straightforward, but some people ask me about the names, and as we go through, I'll talk about that a little bit. So why don't we go ahead and get started. I'm just going to click through these in order, and then we'll just proceed from there. So this is the first drawing, and the year that we're starting in, going back to the archives and trying to get a pinpoint of when I started putting these together and saving them, this one is dated from 2006. I have the window shrunk down a little bit for recording purposes, so you can't actually see the file name and the date. But this one was from September 23rd, 2006, and this design was called Black Flames. Definitely not one of the absolute first I did, but one of the more noteworthy designs that I can remember as I was sort of trying to learn how to manipulate all the different commands in Rhino and put them together to create these flat two-dimensional patterns. One thing that's interesting about this one, way back before my studio's store on Redbubble, way before we had our own website, before I started posting things to a centralized place like DeviantArt, I actually used this design for a similar site that I'm pretty sure still exists, like Redbubble, is meant for turning art into products, and that was a site called Zazzle. And I wanted to experiment with taking my work and putting it on a product, and this is many years ago. It was probably close to 2006, in fact. What I did was I created just a small storefront. I put this design on there in shirts, and I ordered one, and I actually still have it hanging up in my closet. It's just a white plain t-shirt with this design screened on it, and it turned out pretty well. It's a simple design, a flat screen. The quality of the shirt was pretty decent, and I just remember that being an interesting moment where I thought, this is something I've created. I've put it up in a public place, and I'm now able to wear a functional product with my work on it. That didn't really go anywhere. I don't think anybody ever bought anything from that store because I didn't really add much more to it, but it was sort of the point where I started thinking about, okay, what do I want to do with this, since I've always been a person who likes to create things. In fact, before I started doing this in Rhinoceros, I actually made a lot of things in 3D. I think I've mentioned in the tutorials before, but the software itself is meant to be a 3D modeling and rendering piece of software for CGI, computer graphics, but I use a subset of the commands for two-dimensional work to create stuff like this. Well, up until then, I'd been creating random models, different creatures and whatnot. I may go back through the archives and show you guys what some of that looks like. But I'd never really fiddled around with the two-dimensional aspect until I started making things like this, and it was probably around the time that I did this one, I started thinking, well, maybe I should explore this a little more and see. And so from there, I just started experimenting with commands and drawing whatever popped into my head. But this design always has kind of a place in my heart because it was one of the earlier ones that really got me thinking about what I could potentially do with the whole design process. So let's move on to the next one here. This one, according to the file, is dated 9/30/2006. So this one was created a little bit later than the one we just saw, and this one is called Crab Emblem. And this one I remember being somewhat unique in that, unlike the flame patterns before, which is sort of like almost a tribal tattoo type design, this one was a lot more in line with an actual logo or an emblem. As you can see, I'll use my mouse here to sort of highlight. I think this is one of the first designs I ever did that was enclosed in a circular shape like this. You'll see probably in some other samples later, I've done that a lot. It's not really that unique, but with the whole design here, I wanted to create something sort of organic, and if you were sort of going by the shape here, this would be the legs and the claws, and the face would be up here. It's really a rough approximation. It's not really a true crab like we know, but this one I always thought was interesting because it was, again, sort of a building block for ideas that would become more refined later. The whole idea of creating these divided up sections that were almost like cut out would be something that would become a lot more complex later. So this one has got a lesser number of different parts. So it's kind of a starting point. and I ended up using this one in a couple of, well, one of the graphic button series that we've posted I know uses this one. Can't remember off the top of my head which one it is, but this was an interesting design. Next up, this one, according to this one's from 10/22/2006, and this one's called Flame Butterfly. I didn't really have a dedicated schedule when I was drawing these before. As I had free time, I sort of just would sit down on the computer, start messing around in the software and see what came out in the end. And I think this one was probably drawn right around the time as the other two we just saw, just because there's a lot of similarities. First and foremost, the color scheme. Not all of these are going to be just straight black designs. There'll be some diverging color schemes, as we'll see later. But the whole concept of this one is very similar to the Black Flames from the beginning. Obviously, like at some point I decided that I wanted to be vaguely butterfly shaped. This had to have been inspired by like a tattoo or something that I'd seen before. I know I've seen people get tribal tattoos that look very similar to stuff like this, but experimenting with the ideas of sharp edges, curves, and symmetry, which is going to be a major reoccurring theme in these. I can't seem to get away from doing things symmetrically, which some people have pointed out. But this one was sort of more of a variation on the themes from the first one. And I feel like I may have put this one up on that Zazzle store at some point too. It's been such a long time. I might try and track that down and just see what I did on that site out of curiosity. But yeah, this one's pretty straightforward too. Just different design. Okay, so this next one from May 7th, 2008. So we've jumped forward a couple years because we were at the later part of 2006 with the previous design, and now all of a sudden we have jumped into the spring of the next year. And again, the dates are somewhat approximate. I'm not too concerned about the exact month, but the year should be pretty accurate. This design is called the Omens Star, and this one is pretty different in overall theme from the last couple. The last couple were sort of tribal-like in design. The Crab Emblem one is more of a flat logo type design. The Omens Star here is one of the early examples of sort of the abstract, random thought process that goes through my head when I'm making these sometimes. I'm not going to try and claim that it's something profound or some sort of artistic revelation when I'm doing these. Sometimes I literally just let my mind wander and I experiment with the commands in the software, and then out pops something like this. The overall thing I was going for here was something that looked kind of alien or otherworldly. I don't recall, just looking at the little oval, I don't know if you call them eyes, but these petal things around the outside, I don't think that was done using the circular array command, which I do make a lot of use of when I draw these. I feel like these were manually mirrored around just to create symmetrical shape. It's hard to say at this point, but it doesn't look perfectly circular. The whole intersection here looks kind of like jaws, and this part in the middle I guess is supposed to be the eye. But you could see sort of a different take on the whole design process, whereas the others were sort of tribal-like. This one was more weird. I'll call it random, but we'll see a lot of examples of sort of different diverging, if you want to call it methodologies or trains of thought when I'm doing these. I believe this one was also used in one of the other button collections. It might have been the Celestial Array graphic button designs, but I'm pretty sure I used a lot of these star type ones. We'll go ahead and move on. So this next one is from May 12th of 2008. So this one was drawn shortly after the star before it. And this one's called Moon Tree. And I don't really remember what the idea was for this one. Obviously I started with a basic tree theme. And if I remember correctly, because again it's been a while, I actually started with, there's the trunk, and I drew the branches out like this, and then I believe I copied that section and copied it upwards to create more branches on top. I might have scaled it up and made it bigger, but this was the whole thing was created by basically just overlaying this main set of branches. I think it started around here, and then copying it upwards, and then I just rendered it over a red circle, like a red moon. Thinking back, it wouldn't surprise me if some of the genesis for all the ideas behind this one would have been inspired by the Japanese card game, or playing cards, Hanafuda, which I do have some knowledge about. There are some designs in that traditional Japanese card game that sort of remind me of this a little bit. One of them is actually, I think it's a red moon over a hillside. So it wouldn't surprise me if this was sort of inspired by that, either indirectly or sort of subconsciously. But this one, again, is very different from the last two. It's not a logo. It's not sort of an alien type shape. It's just a very simple idea of a tree with a moon behind it. I should put this one on a shirt. I don't think I've done that for this one. I sort of forget about a lot of these designs because I make them and then I either post them or I file them in the archives to be posted later. So going back to these might be a good chance to see what from the archives I can post later. This one might have been posted on DeviantArt. I'd have to look. But yeah, this one was interesting. So moving on, we are now in February 18th of 2009. So we have jumped ahead again to 2009 with this one, and this one is Kudzu Star. This design is another example of how things, at least techniques, I can call them techniques, would start to vary pretty wildly, because compared to everything we've seen so far, this one sort of stands out as an unusual shape. Looking at the sections here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 5, and I believe this is one of the first examples of using the circular array tool to take one of these curved sections and symmetrically copying it all the way around a central point, which would have probably been about here in the middle. The end result of doing that is you get this sort of starfish shape with the eye in the middle. And you'll also notice that this one is green, kind of the beginning of different color schemes and everything not being just straight black monochrome. But this is also one of the more organic designs, and I think I picked out several from the samples in the archive that sort of build on this whole alien or organic tentacle-like theme. I think we'll see that a couple times in some later designs. I remember when I drew this one, it sort of stuck out to me because it was different from a lot of the other ones. And I believe this one was used in one of the other graphic button collections as well. I've picked up a bunch of samples that probably also show up in those collections. If I can recall which ones they are, I'll point it out. But yeah, this one from 2009, I guess this would have been one of the first ones from that year. But we will move along here. So this one is kind of important. This one is actually dated June 8th of 2010. And for those who have heard me talk about video games or are familiar with my work from places like Reddit or DeviantArt, you probably know that I love the Monster Hunter video game series. I think I've mentioned it on my drawing commentary for that Toa Tesscatora emblem, and I've posted all over the place, but Monster Hunter is my favorite video game series, hands down. As of the time of this recording, we're getting really close to the release of Monster Hunter World on next-gen consoles, and in fact, even though this is going to probably date this recording, the beta is going to be opening up soon, and I'm really excited for that. But this design is the face render for the monster Nagas Kouga from Monster Hunter. And this one is sort of significant because, one, this is the start of when I began working on emblems for the Monster Hunter characters, and 2, it's an emblem of my favorite monster in the series. I think I might have mentioned that elsewhere, but the Nagas Kouga is hands down my favorite monster. I thought one day, because I believe maybe a little before this, one of my good friends had introduced me to Monster Hunter, and I had just gotten into the game, and it really hooked me. I probably don't want to go into this too deep, but I started playing Monster Hunter on the PSP. It was Monster Hunter Freedom Unite on the PSP. And once I actually got into the game, it hooked me really bad. And this was the flagship monster from Freedom Unite, I believe, the Nagas Kouga. And at some point, as I was sort of designing all of these things in my free time, I thought, why don't I start creating things from Monster Hunter? I really like the game, I really like the creatures in it, why don't I start drawing them? And this version here, the front view of its face, I had an older version that was a bit more simplified, and later on, I don't remember exactly when, I went back and I sort of updated it and gave it a little bit more shape to build out in the complexity a little. But this is sort of where the whole Monster Hunter design adventure began, and I don't know how many times it's going to come up in this video, but it's going to come up some more. I've done a lot of stuff with Monster Hunter. Maybe you're here because you've seen my other videos or speed drawings on it, but this one was sort of got a special place in my heart. One, because it's my favorite monster and it's sort of a starting point on something I really enjoy working on. So we'll go ahead and move on. Alright, so again, I forgot. It's been a while since I put all these images together, so I don't remember the order. This is another Monster Hunter emblem. This one's from June 9th of 2010, so a little after the last one. And this is the Lagiacrus face. The Lagi is the flagship monster for Monster Hunter Tri on the Wii. And I remember playing that game quite a bit when it came out. That was probably the second or third official Monster Hunter game I played. And this thing was a sort of large sea wyvern leviathan, and it was one of my favorite monsters from that game. And so when I decided to just continue working on the face emblems, I drew this one here. And as we'll see in some of the later examples, these earlier ones are kind of more rough approximations. You could tell by the color and the basic shape what monster it is if you're familiar with the series, but it's still kind of vague, and it's more of a symbol than an actual representation of the face. It's kind of hard to explain, but the details and overall things that I began to do on these designs kind of evolved over time with the Monster Hunter series. It's kind of interesting to go back and look at, because I don't draw these the same now the same way I did, back then. But yeah, this is the Lagiacrus, one of my favorite monsters, and I've drawn a couple different renders of this one. This was the first, I believe. Okay, so moving on, this one is from June 29th of 2010. This one is called Blade Crest. Going back to the single color, more, I don't want to call them tribal, but the regular straightforward designs. This one was, I can't remember what exactly the inspiration was for it, but I wanted to create something that was kind of like a sword logo. I think I came up with the design just randomly, and I ended up using this one on a couple other things. I can't remember off the top of my head. I know this one's up on the store, and I think it's also on one of the graphic button sets. But something about the combination of shapes and the simplicity kind of resonated with me a little bit. I know that sounds like a pretentious thing to say, but I do remember. I always remember this older design, and it always just seems to pop up every now and then. I imagine if people put it on like a cosplay outfit or a weapon, it'd fit in with, runic designs or something like that. But I guess it's nothing really that fancy. It's just sort of an old favorite of mine. All right, moving on. So this one is from July 3rd of 2010. I think we got a couple more in the year 2010 before we move on. This is another one of the more animal-themed ones, which we may see more of depending on which ones I sample. But over time, in addition to abstract shapes or things from video games, sometimes just an animal design would pop into my head. And this one, Ravenous Piranha, is definitely an example of that. When I sat down at my keyboard to start designing something, either from something I was watching or whatnot, fish popped into my head. And I started drawing teeth, and this was the end result. I don't know if I've mentioned anywhere else. For the record, my favorite animals are sharks. And every once in a while, I'll find either fish or sharks sort of creeping into my subconscious when I draw these things. I think I've done that a couple times now. But overall, this one was kind of a departure from the other ones in that it wasn't an actual animal. And this one was, again, diverging from the monochrome black color that most of the other early designs had. So it's kind of an interesting earlier on moment. I do like the teeth on this one. The jaw here would have been created by just drawing one half, dividing everything up, copying the teeth, rotating them into place, and then mirroring the whole thing. That's something I do on almost all these drawings. But I do like the way the teeth and the overall shape. It's simple, but it kind of conveys the theme. It's a hungry fish. Okay, so next up, this design is from July 11th, 2010, and this one is the Runic Lithos. This one is sort of going back to some of the themes you saw in that earlier one with, it was the Kudzu Star that had the sections arrayed around a central point. So this one was drawn pretty much the same way. These individual sections were copied all the way around a central point. Looks like this one was also 5 times, and then this central shape was added later. This one, this one was also using another button set, but I guess the point of the design was to be kind of like a carved stone pattern, which is why it's got this sort of tan brownish color. Other than that, it's sort of just building on the ideas of taking shapes and copying them around a point to create an equally symmetrical shape. And usually, I guess I'll point it out as I see it, but usually you can tell when I did that. It's something I do all the time. I gotta sort of train myself to not fall into a rut when it comes to designing these, but sometimes my mind is wandering. I will literally just kind of repeat the commands with different shapes, and sometimes you get different results, and sometimes it can be kind of similar. But we'll go ahead and move on. Okay, so we're still in 2010. This one's from July 30th of 2010. This is the Alchemic Star. Just like the last one, same basic concept. A single shape copied and arrayed around a central point. This one looks like it was 1, 2, 3, 6 times. A little bit different in overall design. This one is very angular and geometric. It's kind of different from a lot of the other ones so far, which is probably why I picked it. You see, a lot of the other shapes were very curved or sharp looking. This one looks like it was drawn with a ruler almost, or that these clean angular lines were meant to be very geometric in shape. And I think we'll see that with some of the designs later, but I do like how this one almost has a pinwheel type shape. And one thing, I've pointed it out other times, but you look at the overall shape of things, and then you look at the negative space, and it creates different patterns. Like you can see, looks like a pinwheel on the outside, and on the inside it almost looks like a multi-pointed star. And just to set the record straight, it is very, very rare that I do that on purpose. I could probably think of maybe 2 designs where I intentionally did that. A lot of times it's literally just, I'm gonna draw something, and then the end result kind of has this sort of bonus mode, if you will. It's not intentional, but it's kind of cool when it does happen. So let's proceed. Okay, so this one is from September 8th, 2010, and this is one of the designs from the Zodiac series, which is one of the design series that I have that's gone back pretty far, and I've sort of added to it and done things with it since then. And the reason why I picked this one as a sort of representation of the whole Zodiac design series is when I created these, and I don't think I've ever done a commentary video on that whole process. The Zodiac series are meant to be geometric shapes or designs that are carved from geometric shapes. So the way I create these, which is different from a lot of the other ones, is I will create a multi-sided shape. I know this one is 8-sided because it's in the title. I'll create the shape, so this would have been an octagon, and then I will start cutting the actual design out by dividing up sections, adding shapes, and it ends up creating these sort of faces, but I retain the actual shape that it was created from. So it's easier to see on some than others, but the whole point is to create the design from the shape while still retaining the polygon's angles so that you don't lose that. And this is part of the Oracle Zodiac series I started probably in 2010. But what I ended up doing was doing a whole collection of these with different colors and different shapes, different numbered shapes. And it's a series that I've continued to sort of work with over time. I am going to be bringing back the whole idea of these a little bit later with something I'm working on. But this is kind of interesting to look back and see where it started. I think I selected some later entries that are in the design series later and kind of compare and contrast when we get there. Okay, so right now we're at the end of 2010. I think maybe one or two more before we go into 2011. As we go, I sort of started paring down the samples from each year, so it's not going to take this long to go through every year. It's going to speed up a little bit later. This design from 9/11/2010 is called Geo Synchronicity, and I picked this one because it looks very different from a lot of the other ones that are from the same year. The combination of shapes and curves is, I don't know if I've ever done one that looks quite like this. I want to say I was sitting down to draw one day and I thought crop circles, because that's what this thing reminds me of every time I see it. It looks like those geometric circular crop patterns that show up in, alien movies and conspiracy theories. I don't know why I decided to draw one. It just popped into my head, and as a result, it's one of the more unique designs, because I can't think of any other ones that resemble this. Should go back and explore that a little bit more, because it definitely stands out. Aliens. Okay, so we are going back to Monster Hunter designs again here. This is another front render of one of the monster's faces. This one's from November 27th of 2010. So we're wrapping up the year. It was 2010. And this one is Alatreon, one of the very, very famous Elder Dragons introduced in Monster Hunter Tri. I believe it's the first time it showed up. And this thing, if you just look it up, is a massive multi-element dragon that you fight as one of the endgame monsters. And it is an incredibly challenging fight and a really iconic design. And I don't know if I included any of the other Alatreon designs that I've done. I've done a couple. But I remember sitting down to draw it and thinking, I have no idea how I'm going to capture all of the elements for this one, but I'm just going to wing it and see what happens. It's hard to tell from the front view. The biggest thing with Alatreon is it's got these two forward sweeping horns on its head. And it's really easy to see from the side, but from the front I just had to sort of guess. And I think it turned out pretty well. If I could change anything with this one, I might vary the color scheme up a bit. It's not a flat brown, it actually changes color, but I think a lot of people who know this particular monster and who had experience fighting it probably have some good war stories, since even up to the more recent games it's still incredibly challenging and pretty iconic for the series. Okay, I think we're gonna be running into several Monster Hunter type drawings from this particular year. This one, which was from December 1st, 2010, is the Devil Joe front or face emblem. And the Devil Joe is another one of my favorite monsters from the Monster Hunter series. And this one looks like a giant, green, hungry dinosaur. It's nicknamed the Pickle because it's big and green and does sort of look like a pickle, but this thing, which was also introduced in Tri, I believe, basically shows up to ruin your day. It's a nomadic alpha predator, and it's massive. And when it shows up, it's usually at the most inopportune times. You're trying to do something else, and it takes over, and it will devour you alive. And it was always one of my favorites. So when I actually got a chance to try and draw it, this one was pretty fun because I didn't have to think very hard, having some pretty amusing stories and memories of fighting the thing. And I don't know, I think I have a later design that shows it off a little bit more later, but this one was fun. It brought back a lot of memories, and people seem to dig it when I posted it online. Anyone who's played the series seems to know exactly who this is when they see it, so that's kind of a fun one. Okay, going back to regular designs, this one, we're officially into 2011. This is from April 14th. And again, I took samples from each year, so these aren't just the single chronological entries of stuff I've done for the year. It's just, I picked things from each year and tried to do it in order. So this one, Solar Blaze, was from, again, middle of April 2011. This one sort of combined the idea of a design with parts that were arrayed around a central point, which you can see from the fact that it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sections were copied all the way around. But one thing that's a little bit different is I started cutting out circular patterns going in like concentric circles on the inside. I've done that on other ones, but I think if this one didn't have that, the design would look very different. This sort of makes it look like it's almost spiraling if you look at it the right way. And the sort of round shapes combined with sharp edges makes for kind of an interesting combination. I cannot remember if I used this one for one of the graphic collections, but I do remember this design. I like the color scheme. This one's one of the few all red designs I'd done way back in the beginning. So we can go ahead and move on here. Okay, this one is from April 17th of 2011. This is the Prismatic Sigil. So going back to the idea of the sharp angles, this one is definitely kind of like the star we saw before that is primarily made with very rigid geometric shapes that have sections cut out with lines, and it's copied or mirrored over a central plane here. This one was designed to be like a logo or a badge, kind of like some of the earlier designs. I think this one sort of stands out for being a bit more sharp and pointy compared to some of the other ones. We'll see as we go here. This sort of idea comes back many times, but this is one of the more earlier examples of a geometric logo. There's not much to say about this one, but I do like the overall design. I think the lines, the kind of contrasting or converging lines, make this one at least unique to look at. Moving on, this one was also from April 17th, 2011. And this one is called Pincer Curves. Now, I remember posting this one elsewhere. I can't remember if I used it on a website, or maybe I just used the logo in a video game or something that I was playing. But this one is interesting because this one messes around perspective a little bit. It's kind of hard to tell if you look at it straight on, but going back, this whole central part is meant to be surrounded by these curves, and these parts that are like arms are actually inside this ring. So if you think of it with this is the central part and these arms are behind and bounded by the ring, it creates kind of a strange optical illusion, and I don't know if that was intentional when I made this one, but I do remember going back after a while and looking at it and thinking, huh, I never noticed that when I made it, but it seems to work well, and I believe I used this one in one of the other graphic button collections too. It's pretty straightforward, but it did a couple things differently than some of the other ones, so it's one I like to go back and use from time to time, or at least look at the ideas and try and pull that into some of the more contemporary stuff I'm working on. So that one's good to go. Okay, so there's a bit of a story behind this one. This one is from April 19th, 2011. And this one is called Starving Jaws. Overall, I don't think anything in the whole design and drawing process was unique. This one was sort of a combination of the sharp angular tribals, the symmetrical arrayed sections around the middle, and overall, pretty much all the techniques we've seen up till now are used to make this one, and I wouldn't say it's too unique in that regard. Now, the reason why this one has a story is this was one of the first logos or emblems. I usually call these things emblems. This is one of the first ones where I actually used this for avatars, and I think this one was also put onto one of the stores. It might have been on the Zazzle store. I remember using this design for several things. It just seemed pretty iconic, and it wasn't too complicated that I couldn't put it on other things with and have difficulty doing so. So I know whenever I go to events and I'm handing stuff out that our studio's made, when I do QR codes for our website, the QR codes have the scan code and it has this design in the middle. It fits well with sort of circular pattern. It's hard to describe without showing it, but I kind of think of this one as kind of like my business card early on before I actually had a logo for the studio. And so this one sort of stuck with me for a while, and I did end up using it in one of the graphic button sets. And again, it's not an extraordinarily complex design, but it's sort of iconic for me, and I've used it in a lot of things, so it's got sort of a special place in my heart. Okay, so we are moving almost out of the month of April with these in 2011. This is from April 23rd, 2011. This one is called Lash Divinity. I believe this one was used in the same graphic button set as the one we just looked at. I'd have to go back and look, but the whole point of this one was to be like a logo or an emblem, just like the previous ones, but sort of like a demonic or maybe Lovecraftian themed. We'll see that sort of creep into some of the designs later. You see the bounding circular part here, and then the tentacles, and then this sort of face shape here. This one is kind of interesting to me because it's not very complicated. There's not a whole lot to this one, but the combination of shapes seems to work pretty well. I don't know what it is, but it seems like something you'd see on like an alien ship, like an alien battleship or something like that. I think this is one of the ones that I drew, filed away, and then later when I came back to it, I decided, that one's actually pretty memorable, so that's why I used it in the graphic button set. But sort of a good example of things not needing to be too busy to be interesting. And that's something we'll probably see a couple times as we go here. Okay, so this next one is from June 3rd, 2011. And this design is called Blurr Allegiant. And this one is important because this is one of the first of the Armada designs. And I think the last drawing commentary was one of the Armada designs, but to sort of recap, if you've never heard me talk about them, the Armada series is one of the longest running design series that I've been working on, probably since at least 2011, since this is one of the first ones that I found in the archives. But these designs are meant to be reminiscent of ships, if you think to scrolling shooters like your Galaga or Raiden or anything that would have been a top-down scrolling shooter. That's what inspired these Armada designs. They're supposed to be spaceships. If you're looking top-down and the top is pointing this way, so this is the front up here, the nose. And at some point I decided to start drawing these just as sort of an homage to the old scrolling shooters, since I may have mentioned it in one of the Let's Plays, but when I started playing video games way back in the day, the first game I ever played was Galaga, so I was raised on scrolling shooters, if you will. And so I've always liked the idea of messing around with those types of designs. And for the Armada series, what you'll see in some of the later ones as we go through, one of the main themes is these sharp geometric patterns and straight lines, I guess reminiscent of a spaceship or some sort of like starfighter. And the way I put all of these shapes together really evolved over time. It's hard to tell just by looking at this one, but as we'll see in some of the later ones, I experimented a lot with putting these shapes together, and it's one of my favorite series to work on when I'm just sort of doing the equivalent of doodling in the design software. Sometimes I'll just start putting together different shapes and then out pops one of these ship designs. But this one was one of the first, so it's kind of the building blocks of the series, so it's definitely got a place in my heart too, just like some of the other ones, because it's a series I still work on now, and I'm constantly trying to think of new ways to design things. So this next one is from September 5th, 2011, so we're plowing through 2011. I think there's maybe only a couple more before we get into 12. This one is called Crystalline Ring, and this one's going back to the whole organic theme. I believe this was used in one of the graphics sets. Might have been the Organic Swarm set. I don't remember. I can look it up, but I don't want to move around a bunch of windows right now. Like we saw with some of the other ones, this one is meant to be kind of a combination of symmetrical patterns copied around a certain point, but also creating that whole organic alien theme with the way the tendrils and the tentacles and whatnot sort of connect here. And I know people have asked me before where the ideas for stuff like this comes from. I just pull straight out of my head sometimes, man. I sometimes am not referencing anything specific. Maybe I'll have seen a movie or like a sci-fi thing, or I'll think of, aliens from a video game. But other times it just comes out in the drawing, and I know it probably sounds weird to say, but for a lot of these, they just sort of happen over time. I start drawing, and then by the time I stop and render what I'm doing in color, I look at the end result and it's something like this. So without any sort of rhyme or reason, sometimes the stuff just pops out. I don't know, it's kind of the equivalent of like stream of consciousness, I guess. But I do like this one. This one was kind of interesting. It's got a lot of detail to it. So this one from December 16th, 2011. This one is called Chaos Flair. So I mentioned Lovecraft type themes, and I haven't really read a whole lot of Lovecraft, but I'm familiar with like the Cthulhu mythos, and I really like the design behind the whole creatures and demonology behind that. So that's what went into this one. I said, I want to create something that's kind of a Mind Flayer-ish type character, or at least reminiscent of that, and the end result was this thing. And again, going back to tentacles, I think once I had the overall head shape down, it was just a matter of adding in all of the detail and breaking all the parts up, and then adding all of these tentacles here. I would say the idea isn't really that complex. It was just a matter of drawing all of the different individual parts to get the final result here. If I remember correctly, this design was also used in one of the button collections. I want to say this one came from that same Organic Swarm as the one we saw before, but it's also a green color scheme instead of straight black. But I think this is the only Cthulhu-ish one I've done to date. Should look at doing more of those, since the whole mythology is interesting, lends itself to some kind of neat designs. Okay, so this one is from January 14th, 2012. So we are officially in 2012 with this one. And this one is called the Deep Conqueror. I don't remember if I've put any other designs from this series in this collection, but the whole Deep Blank series I did over a bunch of different designs. The whole idea is these would be like deep sea monsters or creatures. And as you can see, the whole idea of experimenting with otherworldly or just strange shaped creatures is starting to get more and more complicated. We saw it on a couple of the previous ones, but compared to some of the earlier designs on this one, there are a lot of individual parts. It's no longer just a combination of simple shapes or circles. This is probably the start of when I began incorporating just a lot of random bits and building out details and building up complexity. I do like this one, and if I remember correctly, this was one of the ones I used as an animation experiment. I believe it's over on DeviantArt. I won't pull it up here, but I took this one and I basically redrew multiple different frames of animation for it to show it sort of breathing and its wings opening up. And then I layered them all together into a GIF to create an actual looping animated thing. I've done that for a couple as an experiment, but I think this was the first time I did that with this one. It's kind of labor intensive because obviously the software is not meant for animation, so I have to create each frame, render it, export it, drop it into something like Photoshop, and then combine all the frames using a GIF creator. But it's an interesting experiment, and I'm probably going to work on that more as we proceed. So moving on, we're going to return to Monster Hunter again. This one's from February 13th, 2012. And this is a side view of TRex, one of the flagship monsters from the game, and very iconic, like a lot of the other ones that I drew. If you've played the series going back, or even the more recent games, you've run into the TRex. It's quite a tough customer and a memorable fight. And so this thing is a giant flying or pseudo wyvern, and as you can tell from its name, it has this tiger-like alternating orange and blue color scheme, and the under part of its jaw and belly are this sort of tan color, and when it gets enraged, its eyes turn red. I knew I was going to be drawing this one at some point. I think, looking back at the archives, I drew the front render of the face first, but I liked this design better, so I put it in the collection. We'll probably see more samples from the side renders as we go, but the whole idea of conveying the actual monster instead of just a rough symbol approximation starts becoming more of a thing as we go. So I think the monsters become a lot more recognizable down the road, and this is sort of where it kind of starts. So that's the TRex. What a jerk. Okay, so I know I've got a couple of these in the collection here. This next one is also from Monster Hunter. This is a side view of the Kushala, which is one of the Elder Dragons, and I believe it was a flagship monster for one of the older Monster Hunter games. Is it G? Freedom? It was one I didn't play, but this thing is an Elder Dragon like Alatreon that we saw earlier on. But Kushala's whole thing is it's a giant metal dragon that can control storms. So when you fight it, it's always flying in the air and shooting tornadoes at you. It's got very sharp edges all over because its skin is metallic. And I tried to capture that here in the side view for the emblem here. And I think it comes through pretty well. A lot of the sharp edges here are pretty in line with the way this thing looks. It's very spiky, and when you see it in game, it reflects the light really well. Really cool monster, one of my personal favorites. And I enjoyed getting the chance to try and draw it. Okay, going back to the regular designs. This one is from March 24th, 2012. This one is called Slice Nebula. I want to say I used this design for something else too. I know it's hard for me to remember. I apologize if it sounds like I'm sort of rambling when I'm trying to remember, but some of these designs are familiar. I liked them enough that I used them for other things, but I can't for the life of me remember what. It's been 5 years. So this one sort of goes back to the idea of taking shapes and again copying them around a circular point to create the main star shape, but then also bounding it with a circle to sort of enclose it as like a symbol or a logo. I do like, and this is something I remember noticing when I went back to this one years ago, the circular border here cuts through the edges of the star here, and it creates these 4 sort of empty stripe parts. And I don't know why that, but my eye always just jumps to those points every time. It's not meant to be superimposed or sort of behind it, but for some reason the whole frame of this thing, the boundary and then turning white as it cuts through, it just catches my eye, and I don't know why. If anybody else notices that when you look at that, I'd be interested to hear if it jumps out at anyone else. It could just be the way my eye catches negative space. But I like this one. This one I used for one of the other, I think it was the Insignia Badge series of graphic buttons. I believe I used this one. Okay, so moving on to April 14th, 2012. This one is called Sectile Seal, and this one is a little bit unusual compared to some of the other ones we've seen so far. Again, keeping with the theme of using multiple sections arrayed or copied around a certain point, this one would have been 4 sections. For some reason, this one sort of stands out because it combines some of those circular geometric shapes with these insect-like legs, and so what ends up coming out in the end is almost bug-like. And I think I used this one for one of the graphic button series too. Seems like a lot of the ones that I'm selecting for the sake of this video also belong to series that it's kind of a coincidence. I didn't plan that. Compared to some of the other ones, this is definitely a more simple design, but it just looks different and unusual, and I think it's the legs. It sort of reminds me of a centipede. Pretty straightforward, but kind of unusual, and the negative space creates some interesting shapes in the middle too. Okay. Next up, this one's from May 24th, 2012, and this one is called Famine Fangs. I want to say when I started drawing this one initially, it was going to be an Armada design. I'd have to go look and see where I filed this one, but I don't think it's actually filed as one of the ship designs. It could be. This could be a more like organic or alien looking ship with all these sharp parts and tentacles and then what looks like eyes in the middle. I think for this one, I just said I'm gonna create something that looks very, very alien in design, and ultimately you get this dark purplish and orange combination of weird features. I would say that having to export this to Photoshop for a final rendering, having to delete all of the circles would be a pain. Nowadays, instead of having the circles in there, I'll divide up the sections so that I don't have to go and delete all the sections when I port this over to Photoshop. But I guess for this one, I just want a lot of little circles as part of the texture. It's interesting. Kind of different from a lot of the other organic shapes so far. Alright, so next up, this one's from May 26, 2012. This one's called Molten Horror, and this one was probably a very similar design process to the one we just saw back here. They were done probably pretty close together, but apparently I was on some sort of alien tentacle monster kick when I was making these. They're not related in any way, but a lot of the design themes and overall elements are kind of similar. I didn't never really notice that because I don't look at these back to back that often. But I do think it sort of fits. Again, this one could be a ship design too if I really wanted to, but I think it's just meant to stand alone as a sort of weird alien creature. I don't think this one's in the store. I might put that one up in the store. Seems like a kind of interesting sample. Okay, so this next one is from June 1st, 2012. And this one is sort of the first one in the retrospective series here that's from the Draconic Council design series. Another one that's been going for quite a while. One of the series that I will add to every once in a while is the series of dragon faces. You probably can tell if you've ever seen my sculpture or my papier-mâché work, but between Monster Hunter and that stuff, I do like dragons. I think they're pretty neat. And so I started creating this series of dragon faces. And this was one of the first. This one's called Cyan Diver. It was not the first one. I can't remember off the top of my head which was the absolute first, but this was one of the earlier ones, and it's meant to be a water dragon by the color scheme, if I remember. And just like the techniques used on the Monster Hunter faces, I incorporated a lot of those techniques when I was creating these. So some of these earlier ones you'll see it's just the upper jaw. Later on they'll have the lower jaw, so it's actually a full face. But I basically started around the eyes. I usually start drawing these things from the eyes and building outwards and adding spikes or horns or whatnot, and then just playing around with the shape until I'm satisfied with what it looks like, and then it's just a matter of mirroring the whole thing. And I think it pulled a couple different samples from the series that I've posted so far, so we'll be able to see sort of the difference in themes and the difference in techniques. So this one is from April 18th to 2013, so we have now jumped from June of 12 to April of 13, and this one is called Spine Worm. This one's not tied to any series, and as far as I can tell, it was just a random standalone design, but I must have had dragons or winged snakes on my mind that day, because that's what this one turned out to be. I do like the sort of wing that comes up here, but it also has this sort of orb thing around it. I don't know what the whole point of it is. It just kind of looks neat. This is a good example of just a random design that isn't too complicated and turned out pretty well in the end, I think. It'd be a good logo for like a flag, or for, you know, a weapon or a piece of armor. I can't remember if I've posted this one in our store either. And I haven't used it in any collections. It's just kind of one of those standalone ones that I look at and go, huh, that one turned out alright. Okay, so this one is from May 10th of 2013. This is another one of the Armada series. This is the second one we've seen so far. I haven't looked at too many yet. This one is called Phantom Wing. And going back to the whole idea of these ship designs being very geometric and angular, one thing that I worked into this one was sort of a butterfly theme. That's why it's shaped this way. I do like the idea of having the wings and everything around the body, and then the central part of the ship right here. One thing you'll see, and I don't know if I've ever talked about this, these bits here are meant to be sort of like connectors on the body and wings, and a lot of times I will do that to break up the design and also add highlights or color variation to these ships when I'm designing them. I've done it with these geometric shapes. If the piece is more curved, I'll do it with circles. I don't remember when I started doing it, but it just sort of seemed like a good way to break up everything, to create some variation, and it's just something I've continued to do with these. It's really something I do without even thinking. But this one's a bit more complicated than the other one, I think. I like that the shapes are not too chaotic. Everything's divided up nicely, and it's pretty decent color scheme too. Okay, I think we're going to be looking at a couple of Armada designs here. This one is from May 11th, 2013. This is the Riser Volge. And this one was from the Riser Squadron, which was a series of Armada ship designs all centered around different blades. They were all named for different types of weapons. And this one was interesting because unlike all the other Armada designs I think we've seen up to this point, they've been very flat and angular, and this one incorporates sharp edges and curves. And so it almost looks like a more organic design, but it's still meant to be a ship. Like I mentioned on the last one, I did use the connectors here, but I use circles because it's more of a rounded, curved shape. And this one is got a lot of spiky edges on it. I think it would make a decent shirt design. For that whole collection, the Riser Squadron, I did put them all up on Redbubble. I think I did it in one big group. But usually if I have a themed collection designs, I'll post them on our store if I want to put them all together. But I do like this one. It's pretty straightforward. I do like the colors. Okay, this one is from a different Armada collection. I want to say it was the 9 Blades. I apologize for not knowing all this off the top of my head. This one is from May 23rd, 2013, and it's called Stag Talon. I think it's from the very first set of designs that I had posted that were from a themed series. But this one is one of the more complicated early designs compared to the very first couple we looked at. I think it's very busy, but it's also kind of interesting to look at just because there's so much. The central body is sort of blocky, but then it's got all of these prong-like wings and extensions here. Thinking back to like Ray Storm and a lot of the other scrolling shooters, Ikaruga, I imagine these would be weapons or missile batteries or something like that. The ship designs when I do them are usually not based on anything, and as I'm drawing them I think, well, okay, if I was going to see this in a game, or I was going to fight something like this, how would it behave? So this one sort of just evolved into this monstrosity. It's one of the bigger ones, but I do like it. It's pretty basic color scheme, but it's just got a lot of moving parts to it. Okay, so this one is from July 31st, 2013. And I think we've got a couple more left, and then we'll be going into 14. Like I mentioned before, I sort of started paring down the sampling just so this wouldn't take 4 hours for me to narrate. This one from 7/31/2013. This is Zinogre from Monster Hunter, and I think this one, kind of like the Nagas Kouga way at the beginning, is one of the most recognizable of the designs that I've done. Zinogre was the flagship for Portable Third on PSP, I believe. And if you've never played Monster Hunter, Zinogre is a big quadrupedal fanged wyvern. It looks like a wolf, and it's got these big arms and these horns and all this fur. And it basically fights you by running you down. It does all these acrobatic flips, and over time it charges up, and when it charges up with electricity, it goes into sort of like a Super Saiyan mode, and it gets spiky and a lot more difficult to deal with. I would say Zinogre is probably my second favorite monster in this series. And I'd done a side render of this one as well, which I think turned out okay, but this front view is probably my favorite of the face emblems that I did for Zinogre. It's pretty iconic. I do like its blue and sort of off tan color scheme with its light blue fur. Overall, just a really cool monster, and I'm really hoping it shows up in the world. So this next design from August 9th, 2013. This is another one from the Dragon Face series. This one's called Vermilion Wrath. When I started doing, what I did was I would usually draw a front face for one of these, or a side face, and then later on I'd go back and draw the other perspective, whichever it was. This one was a bit more of a departure from some of the older ones in that, one, it was a lot more irregular and evil looking, and two, this one was sort of the start of more varied color schemes. This one is meant to be fire themed, which hopefully is clear just by the color patterning. But because I was also doing the Monster Hunter series at the same time, I would sort of experiment with either this series or the other one and try and see what I can incorporate from one series and the other. And so a lot of the dragon faces and these ones, unlike the Monster Hunter designs, are original. Designs I thought of as I was working on the different pieces. A lot of them bear some resemblance technique-wise to the Monster Hunter ones. There's a bit of overlap, but I tried not to let, one influence the other too much, so it wouldn't sound like I was just, or look like I was copying them. But I do like this one.